Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, welcome everyone. And this is another Transpacific lecture. And today we have the honor of welcoming Professor Stefan Halikowski Smith. Sorry. He is associate professor at Swansea University, where he teaches early modern world history. His books include Creolization and Diaspora in the Portuguese Indies and two missionary accounts of Southeast Asia in the late 17th century, a translation and critical edition of Guy Taccard's Relation de Voyage aux Indes, and Nicola Sima's Relazione distinta dei regni di Siam, Cina, Tuncino e Cochinchina. I'm very glad, Stefan, that you wanted to join us today, and I give you the word.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I hope that it might lead to further collaboration. We've already been having fairly intensive discussions about statistical research on the Manila Galleon, whether the Spanish have actually formulated year by year data sets of every ship, every cargo that made that journey. Chanu, of course, made his contribution back in 1960, but we need, for the paper that I promised your research centre on the British occupation of Manila and how it disrupted the galleon trade, we need to scrutinize those statistical data sets very carefully in order to come to meaningful and worthwhile conclusions. There's many scholars working in the Philippines, Montalbano. I'm not sure they've had the resources to visit Archivo de las Indias in Seville. And as a result, they're rhetoricians. They're playing with words and concepts, but without having done the primary research, I think it's much less valuable. And I don't want to fall into that trap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present another topic to you today. I'm on somewhat safer grounds. It relates to a publication I made in 2009 in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society on one of three very interesting British trading handbooks dealing with commerce in the East Indies. Charles Lockyer being the other, and Lewis Roberts III, possibly a Welshman with a name like that. Lockyer is much better than Hamilton in providing the detail of the commodities, the trade routes, the bureaucratic impedimenta that made country trade for an interloper, which is what these individuals were. They were breaking the official East India Company monopoly. What made it worthwhile was tolerated interloping. Many people think that this was an advantage over the British trade. It was an advantage that the British had over the Dutch in this period. It was less punitive, it was less rigid, and that there was considerable accommodation made to birds that flew in different flocks. Hamilton, for example, agreed to be recalled to work for the maritime defense of Bombay in 1717 when this was necessitated. So he wasn't AWOL or completely off the radar. Now, Hamilton is interesting because he tells stories, he tells histories, he provides histories of places that don't really stand up to rigorous scholarly scrutiny. And he has a number of stereotypes that need challenging, primarily that of La Leyenda Negra, the black legend propagated in North European Protestant countries from the mid-16th century that enjoyed depicting Spanish achievements as the products of cruelty, avarice, and illegality. So we need to use his text a little bit more carefully than we have hitherto. I say using his text hitherto. There's very little research going on in British imperial studies. If you ask students, even in their second years, when was the British Empire, they aren't able to give you the answer to that. If you ask them who was the first British emperor, because surely you don't have empires without emperors, they don't know. And I even challenged first years. I asked them what, I provided them with some common confusions that students make here when they enter their studies. They're confused empirical and imperial. I didn't want to even start to go into empirical because that raises issues of scientific method. I think that's already way too complicated for students at Swansea, but I did expect them to know what the word imperial, what noun the word imperial, the adjective imperial stems from. Which noun does it stem from? I think they're not taught grammar, so they don't know what nouns and adjectives were, and their answer to that question was important. They thought the word imperial stems from the noun or substantive important. Perhaps there was a confusion there between imperial and imperious. Imperious means high-handed, it means declamatory, it means autocratic. Now, we have other texts, of course, diaries, which have been published at various stages. Two that I've used perhaps most extensively, the Hakluyt edition of the Bengal chief factor William Hedges' diary, and the many volumes of ponderings and reflections by the fondateur de Pondichéry, François Martin, which came out in one series. Looks like the French edition in the picture, but there's also an Indian series that perhaps deals with years that were not included in the original series run. Now, here is a book on English gentleman merchants at work by a Danish researcher, Søren Mentz. I'm sure Wim is familiar with it. They were working in Indian Ocean waters that were internationalized to an unprecedented degree, and in the 18th century, under no nations took dominion. The historian Holden Ferber has gone down with the famous quip, nationality stopped east of the Cape. It was a time when company commerce of both the Dutch and the English East India companies was overlaid by a vigorous country trade of private merchants and ship owners. Those strictly speaking interlopers, historians like J.H. Parry have credited Hamilton and Pitt operating outside the company monopolies with the, quote, spread of English commercial influence around the shores of the Indian Ocean. And to 19th century or early 20th century British colonialist historiography, people like Hamilton represent, quote, outstanding examples of the British adventurer at his best. Shrewd, capable, cool, taking the knocks of fortune with equanimity. But the question is whether he was a fair historian. Now, his text, I think I've shown you in the first slide, was written up over 2 long winters in Edinburgh in 1727. They are lengthy overviews, tour d'horizon of indeed the many corners and crevices of a sea-going country trade of that time. But he doesn't talk very much about himself. We don't know how he came to be in the Indies, what specific roles he played, and his own life and death remains somewhat mysterious, although I think in my prologue I complimented Tony Ballantyne, now retired, for his entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, which is a very serious undertaking. So Hamilton works off the premise that Portugal Indico, was long exanimated and dead in this part of the world. And historians, even Portuguese historians, would largely go along with this analysis. Rogério Miguel Puga talks about the somnolencia, the somnolence of the Portuguese Spartans. René Barrensa, in his great work, The Arabian Seas, highlights the, quote, threadbare realities of the Portuguese cartaz system. Cartaz system, as I was explaining to students yesterday, it's a mafioso system, protection racket, whereby bona fide traders would pay the Portuguese a certain amount of money for protection. Protection from whom, you might ask? Protection from the Portuguese. That's how mafioso economics functioned. So the cartaz system was not functioning really anymore, largely because there weren't enough patrol vessels to enforce it. The cartazes were only purchasable at some of the pontos chaves, the key points of the remaining Portuguese system that was spread very thinly from one corner, Socotra, the mouth of the Red Sea, Hormuz, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, to Malacca, which surveyed or patrolled the vessels plying eastwards into the South China Sea via the Sunda Straits, the Malaccan Straits. Later, Singapore acquired that role. So those are the three pontos chaves that were still exerting some influence, although Malacca, of course, as we will see, fallen to the Dutch in 1641, and many of the Portuguese port settlements in the Arabian Peninsula, for example, were taken in the 1620s, not so much by the Dutch, but by indigenous rebellions. Elsewhere, we can see, just from the scale of commerce undertaken, that Portuguese were reduced to a smaller scale of operation. Hucksters with a couple of bottles of arak, but no longer sizable ship owners or traders. Now, we have to be very careful, of course, in assessing the Portuguese official as opposed to unofficial trade. In the East, Anthony Disney, the Australian historian, has drawn attention to two models, South Asian and an East Asian model. And whereas the South Asian was still aligned to crown concerns and official hierarchies and positions, the East Asian model was extremely fluid and autonomous. Here, perhaps I should have included this picture in my PowerPoint. We see some of the new research to emerge into this field. I will show you some temple frescoes later. This is a depiction of a Luso-Asian trading vessel visiting Burma. You can see the Mokadao figure. These are Malay ship men. The Mokadao was a eunuch. Here we can see very effeminate, who assuaged the very male and very violent and often anarchic behaviors on board the ship. So we have to go below the radar really to discover the Portuguese that remained. Now, there are some scholars, Glenn Ames, who died unfortunately very precociously at the age of 55, has produced a book with the Amsterdam University Press, Renascent Empire, in which he makes a case for both a second and even a third wave of renewal. here concentrating on the second wave. This is, of course, post-independence Bragançan Portugal, the new dynasty. He sees in early 1672 traditional voyages from Macau to Manila in Indonesia being laid on at crown expense. They had been extinct for many a year. And the reinstatement of permanent crown authority in key outlying fortresses like Macau and Timor, which was useful for the yellow sandalwood collection. Diplomatic initiatives were launched, including the dispatch of Manuel Saldanha to China, 1667 to 1670, and the nomination of a new Captain General in Macau, Don Alvaro da Silva, to address, quote, the miserable state and great problems one finds in the city of Macau. Right, here you see the cover of my first book. This is not a willful act of self-promotion. I learned yesterday from giving this trial run lecture with my students that it helped to understand and contextualize the role of Portuguese adventurers in the Peguan-Siamese wars that raged over much of the 16th century. The very eminent SOAS historian Victor Lieberman has worked on the fundamental shift in power from the northern Avan states of Burma to the sea or the coastal Peguan states. And he asked the question, why was this? Usually the coastal regions were rent by malaria, they were swamp-ridden, and demographically they were 3 times less densely inhabited than Mandalay and Bagan and some of the northern provinces. But that changed with the Portuguese and indeed the commercial revolution. Money was made from commercial activity. Many of the Asian traders who were put off by the Portuguese conquest of Malacca preferred to come to lower Burma, ports like Mataban, to conduct trade. And with the money from trade, the rulers of the lower Burma, especially Tabin Shweti, were able to hire mercenaries, initially Indian Muslims, but increasingly Portuguese, as you can again see in one of these rare temple epigraphs. Now, temple epigraphs, as I deal with in my book, have often been overlooked by historians because they are used to tell the tales of the Jatakas and the lives of the Buddha. So they are considered purely fanciful, invented, and fictitious. But they were based on some sort of reality that the artists were observing in the world around them. And here we see a clearly identifiable Luso-Asian with a musket standing protection over port beauties who are looking at themselves in mirrors. Now, here we see him dutifully performing his protective role, but if you read histories of this period, and indeed Alexander Hamilton's account, then the word lusuria is on the tip of everyone's tongue, because lust led to abominable crimes, in the words of Fernão Mendes Pinto, rape and kidnapping, which earned the Portuguese a bad name. If you look at the Burmese Great Chronicles, then even their great unifying ruler, Tabin Shweti, is seen to become alcoholic as a result of associating with these unseemly heretics. Probably I should look at the Mon term for heretic a little bit more carefully. Obviously, heretic was one of the words that the Portuguese used to describe the Dutch, but what does that mean in the nation context? Okay, the question that emerges is whether this lusuria was a product of a degenerating Portuguese society in the tropics, or, as Cayetano Socorras would have it, a typical Iberian proclivity for impetuosity and a tragic gambling with death. Here we come to the Black Legend, Hamilton's interpretation of the Portuguese as the most dissolute, lazy, thievish rascals that were to be found in the country. We have, however, very interesting accounts from Asian anthropologists, primarily the work of the Frenchman Jacques Nepot in the Irrawaddy Valley, where he sees some of these gangsters, Veloso and Ruiz, Spanish as much as Portuguese, commemorated here as two adopted sons of King Sata of Longvek. Longvek, sorry, is of course Cambodia, not Burma, but I'm equating them here as Southeast Asian interpretations of Portuguese adventurers. Here we're seeing them elevated to the lofty heights of Bacchus, hereditary guardians of the sacred sword, so highly important ritualized positions who claim descent from Spanish and Portuguese adventurers' marriages with Cambodian princesses. We see regalia that has been appropriated from the Portuguese adventurers, black hats, which become part of the official crowns used in coronation ceremonies in the Mekong Valley. So the question is, by using La Leyenda Negra, is Hamilton distorting Southeast Asian realities? And we see overlaying Protestant prejudice. Perhaps Hamilton is speaking ill of Ayutthaya, is speaking ill of the Portuguese, because his own personal experience is not particularly positive there. He incurred dreadful financial loss and almost lost his own life from speaking treasonably of the Siamese king. Even today, of course, lèse majesté, one of the capital crimes on the Thai statute book. Okay, perhaps I should describe this picture. This is a French researcher in Paris, Anne Chu, who has worked on temple murals from caves, hermit caves, again in Lower Burma for the first time here, publishing depictions of the Portuguese, here carrying favor with the Sangha, ruler here, donning one of these typical Iberian black hats in solidarity with the adventurers in question. Okay, how have you learnt, what have you learnt about the fall of Malacca in 1641 to the Dutch? One of the key events, Wendepunkte in the fortunes of the Portuguese in the East. You know, time-old question, when did Portuguese decline set in? Should we go back as the 1550s in terms of structural problems in the economy, as Vitorino Magalhães Godinho has suggested, or do we need to wait until the arrival of the Dutch and the conquests of some of the key strong points in the East? So how did Malacca fall to the Dutch? Hamilton recounts how the Portuguese governor Manuel de Sousa Coutinho simply bought off, or he paid off the Dutch by giving them 80,000 pieces of 8 and tricking his council of war into doing nothing as the Dutch were throwing grappling hooks, erecting ladders, and storming the fortress. But if you look at other primary resources, other explanations emerge. Here is one famous compendium, Batavia, put together admittedly post facto in 1799. It estimates 1,000 Dutch deaths. Therefore, there was real conflict. It wasn't being, the Dutch weren't paid off. It describes Coutinho's haughtiness, his pride, his refusal to surrender, indeed, and indeed the seasonal blockades, the long repeated attempts by the Dutch to storm that fortress. We actually know that Coutinho died a few days after the surrender, so that altered the official devassa. When a battle was lost, important stronghold was lost, then the Portuguese would hold an official judicial inquiry into the circumstances of that. I haven't been able to find the Portuguese devassa. That might have something to do with Coutinho's early demise. But we do have letters from Dutch sergeant majors, Lamotius, the day after the city fell, the 15th of January, published by P.A. Loipa, who reports the attacks and indeed medals of valor to Commander Wilson Kateko, etc. So it did seem that the depiction of Malacca falling as a result of Portuguese corruption to be somewhat untrue. Okay, the final case study that I'm going to present to you today is a war between Macau and Timor between 1688 to 1703. And in telling the story of this war, Hamilton is portraying a Portuguese world in the East rent by quarrels and infighting, a world that was breaking down. There was no longer unified Portugal Indico. Hamilton suggests that the Macanese were by fair means trying to get the whole government of the country into the church's hands. So the Timor trade had been traditionally conducted by merchants from Macau, but what Hamilton's intimating is that the very strong religious lobby, Macau was primarily a seminary for training clerics who were, it was hoped, would open up China, would convert the Kangxi emperor and spearhead the largest conversion, largest and most important conversion hitherto undertaken. The Timorese, however, according to Hamilton, would never suffer Macau to interfere with the government of their country, and the Viceroy of Goa, a third actor, intervened, sending an embassy to persuade González Gomez, the Timorese general, to accept a governor general and archbishop from Goa, although this embassy failed. We haven't been able to identify this González Gomez, so that's why I put him in speech marks. But he was probably one of the Hornees, one of the Dutch Timorese half-caste local war barons. How can we understand this war if we turn to the foremost historians of this part of the world? Michael Smithies calls them internal revolts of the Timorese, so infighting rather than a generalized problem within Portugal Indico. Dampier, of course, a very interesting circumnavigating would-be British aristocrat stroke pirate. He doesn't even suggest there was any conflict. George Bryan Sosa, who's written a very good book, of course, on 17th century Macau. He's interested in primarily economic considerations. Goa was interested first and foremost in the trade of the sandalwood, and therefore the embassy was nothing more than a stimulating trade mission. Alexander Pinto was a Portuguese captain who went out, Hamilton claims, in his boat. We aren't able to identify who that might have been. The name is too far from that of Coelho Guerreiro, who led the Goan embassy and re-established peace in Timor. So we have to attribute that one of the problems of memory, that Hamilton, an active sea captain, is recalling these stories many years post facto during these long winters as a retiree in Edinburgh. Perhaps he couldn't remember the name of his fellow voyager. I mean, it's not so out of sorts. The Portuguese sometimes sent viceroys in British ships of the line, British East India ships. So their own viceroys were sent to Goa, not on Portuguese ships anymore, but in English ships. But it could be that an embassy was made from Goa in a British private vessel that belonged to Hamilton, but we have no way of establishing that with British sources. Perhaps I should rummage around in Den Haag, and who knows, I might be able to find some Dutch intelligence reports that could open up new vistas on this hitherto inconclusive problem. But I believe that's my last slide. I'm at 12:38, so you've had me for 38 rather than 45 minutes, but perhaps we can lengthen the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Okay. So I can continue. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. I have various ideas. I'm not really a specialist in this topic. I think Wim maybe has more insight into what you have been talking about, but you raised lots of interesting aspects also of what we are engaged with, and you also cited some of the persons that also appear in our research, of course. And I think something that we have seen again and again also what was evident in your talk, you cannot simply just see one oceanic space or so as a closed up ocean or a closed up space, and you see how much interference there was, and especially in terms of, I think, the Spanish. If we are talking about the Spanish, we may never forget about the Portuguese who were there and who were actually there even earlier in many places than the Spanish. So please, I open the floor for discussion also from for our audience who has joined from other parts of the world. Wim?